Welcome to this class on Heroes of the Reformation. We started this class many weeks ago and spent 8 sessions, and then we got interrupted by the virus, and we're not able to meet in person. So what we are doing here is a kind of creative alternative. We're going to spend 3 sessions on video. We'll look at the life of John Calvin, the life of Ulrich Zwingli, and the life of John Knox. And so today in this first session, we're going to continue what we had begun on the life of Calvin. So let's go ahead and let me show this slide on the screen, which is a picture of Geneva, Switzerland. Why Geneva, Switzerland? Well, several years ago was the 500th anniversary of the birth of John Calvin. And there were all kinds of celebrations, especially in Geneva, where he had served a number of years as a pastor. And for the 500th year celebration, they developed a new Swiss chocolate in honor of John Calvin. They also crafted a new beer with a picture of Calvin on the label called Calvinus beer. And then, in addition to that, they invented a new wine, and there were a number of things that they developed in celebration of him. In subsequent years, there is a group that's even come up with a brand of coffee. If you don't like beer or wine, there is now a brand of coffee. It's called Reformed Roasters, and it says that it's coffee that chooses you. You don't choose it, it chooses you. There are several blends. There's the Total Depravity blend, and that's because men love the dark roast, it says, or if you prefer, Perseverance of the Saints, your daily great awakening. So if you pour yourself with a cup of Perseverance of the Saints, we will persevere during this session. Why all this interest in Calvin and Calvinism? There are a number of people who would be interested in this. For example, there are the neo-Calvinists that some call themselves. There are the crypto-Calvinists, and for the last decade or more, the young, restless, and reformed, all of whom have a commitment to some form of Calvinism. There's one other group, and the answer is found in this riddle. What do you call a Calvinist drinking Mountain Dew? What do you call a Calvinist drinking Mountain Dew? A hyper-Calvinist. So there are a number of brands of Calvinists. A number of myths have developed about Calvinism, things that are not true, but that circulate and cause some people to misunderstand what Calvinism is. For example, some say that Calvinism destroys evangelism. Not really true. Or Calvinism appeals to the pride of man. Or Calvinism stunts holiness. Or Calvinism teaches that men are merely robots. Or that Calvinism diminishes the God of love. Untrue myths and caricatures. We don't have an opportunity to discuss those today, but I did want to quickly look at 2 myths, 2 misunderstandings about Calvin himself, about the man. We're trying to clarify some of these controversies. What are they? Number one, some people think that Calvin was a kind of tyrant, that he was a severe, depressing, joyless person. He had no joy in his life, always with a frown on his face. That actually is not true. For example, Dr. R.C. Sproul, in writing on Calvin, has made this explanation. He said the caricatures of Calvin as a dour, stiff, cold tyrant are drawn by those who have never plumbed the depths of his thought. To counteract these distorted images, I often have my students read his chapter on prayer in the Institutes before they read anything else of Calvin. Here they get a glimpse of a man as they eavesdrop on a soul naked before God. It defies that stereotype that some have. Well, why have some people thought that Calvin is severe and joyless? Well, perhaps because they've understood some of what has occurred during his lifetime. He experienced a number of hardships and had a number of situations that indeed would have provoked tears. He could have given away and become a very severe depressed person because of them. What were those hardships? Well, for one thing, he lost his mother as a child. He was only 5 or 6 years old when his mother died. Was raised by his father in a single-parent family. And not too many years after the death of his mother, his father sent him off to Paris to study, alone with no parents around. Later on, when he married, very soon after their marriage, he and his wife lost a son in infancy. And he went through that deep, intense grief of a parent losing a child. On top of that, he went through the death of his wife at a young age. Married not too many years, his wife died. Calvin never remarried, remained a widower for 15 years, and bore the agony and the loneliness of having lost his wife. On top of that, shortly after the death of his wife, his stepdaughter was caught in adultery. And Calvin, as a pastor, was embarrassed for a period of time to even leave his house and to look people in the eye because of what had happened to his daughter. On top of this, he faced numerous health problems, chronic problems that were with him for a number of years. And in addition to all of that, he had a very heavy preaching and writing ministry that indeed could have weighed him down. But in spite of all of these circumstances, he didn't give in to the circumstances and become a joyless, morose kind of a person. How do we know that there was a note of joy in the life of Calvin? Well, one way is by looking at the letters that he has written. And if you look at some of his letters, you see that indeed he was a joyful human individual. His letters show his warmth of devotion, the depth of his feeling that he experienced. For example, I put on the screen one quotation from Calvin when he said, "There is not one blade of grass, there is no color in this world that is not intended to make us rejoice." He was continually looking for evidence in the theater of creation for that which would cause joy in his life. Another reason for saying that he was not a joyless person or a person devoid of warmth was what he chose as his personal emblem. He chose a flaming heart held in his hands. A flaming heart held in his hands, offered to God in warmth of love and devotion. He said, "My heart I give to you, O Lord, promptly and sincerely." Here is a man who had a depth of piety and of warmth towards the Lord. And that belies the kind of stereotype that he went through life depressed and joyless. Another stereotype that some people have attached to Calvin is that Calvin was guilty of murder. Time magazine ran an article about Calvin and called him that heretic burner. And so the question is, was Calvin's involvement in the death of Servetus a mistake? Let me explain a little bit of what we're talking about in this controversy with Servetus. Michael Servetus was a young Spanish physician and mathematician. At an early precocious age, at the age of 20, he published his first book called Errors on the Trinity. It was full of heretical ideas. And because of this, because it was so controversial, he was forced to go under a pseudonym in some areas and to flee to the city of Paris. And in fact, it was in the city of Paris that Servetus, the young physician, met Calvin. Calvin was very concerned about his heretical views on the Trinity. And so Calvin, out of concern for him and for what this would do to the church who was exposed to these ideas, Calvin tried to set up a series of public forums in which the two men would dispute back and forth. And he could try to correct some of the mistakes of Servetus. But Servetus refused to meet with the great reformer and engage in these forums or debates. And instead of renouncing this heresy, Servetus ended up writing a second book called Restitution of Christianity. And the second book perpetuated the same heresies again. And so although he was unwilling to meet face to face with Calvin in a debate, the two men took up strongly worded correspondence with each other. Why did Calvin do this? Why did he even bother getting involved in this discussion back and forth? Because Calvin believed that the error of Michael's views on the Trinity erodes the death of Christ and his atoning work for sinners. Calvin said, when the matter is to combat for his glory, we must set his service above every human consideration. Or another statement that Calvin made that reflects why he got involved in this debate about this heresy, he said, a dog barks when his master is attacked. I'd be a coward if I saw that God's truth is attacked and yet would remain silent. You can't remain silent in the face of false doctrine and heresy. And so Calvin, indeed, out of concern for Servetus and his soul, out of concern for the church and the health and purity of the church, was willing to speak up on this. Because of these two books and the heresies that were propagated, Servetus ended up being arrested because of the new books, mainly. And he was put on trial by the Roman Catholic authorities in his hometown of Vienna. But he escaped from their clutches. And so when he was on the run throughout Europe, he ended up passing through the city of Geneva. And though he was warned not to do so, he ended up attending a sermon preached by Calvin in his church in Geneva. Because of his carelessness, they caught Servetus again, and he was rearrested and held for trial. At his trial, Calvin believed that the issue was truth, but he also wanted to show mercy. And so Calvin asked the Geneva City Council for a less painful death. He said, if this burning it at the stake, that could take 30 agonizing minutes. How can you be so cruel? And Calvin suggested instead beheading, which was instant. And he said, I hope the judgment will be capital in any event, but I desire cruel punishment withheld. And so he speaks out and shows a sense of mercy for Servetus. Sometimes that's forgotten by those who are critical of Calvin. Calvin also showed pastoral compassion. At the request of Servetus, he was willing to meet with him prior to his death, and he received from him apologies. The two had a good meeting. But Calvin wanted him to show that final repentance, to renounce his heresy, and so there would not have to be capital punishment. But Servetus remained firmly committed to his heretical views. And so Servetus was tied to the stake. His book was strapped to his arms, sulfur was placed on his head, and the flames were lit. As Servetus was burning at the stake, he called out, Jesus, thou Son of the eternal God, have pity on me. And some have said, isn't this an indication that he really had changed? Actually, if you look at it very carefully, it doesn't. Because in that very statement, he's repeated the very same heresy that he had propagated. The heresy that Jesus was not eternal, that Jesus was not a co-eternal member of the Trinity, that Jesus was a secondary created being. He says God is eternal, but he's separating Jesus out as the Son of the eternal God, not eternal himself. And so people have looked at this and said, I'm going to blame Calvin for this. Calvin is guilty. He's wanted for murder. However, there are some mitigating circumstances that are helpful to understand. And Dr. J.I. Packer has explained some of these circumstances that help us to understand this event. Number one is that the Trinitarian heresy as a capital crime was a cultural reality not invented by Calvin, but it predated him by centuries. It had been going on for hundreds of years. This was not something new propagated by Calvin at this time in revenge against Servetus. Secondly, others were burned for similar heresies as late as 1612 in England. And so this was simply in a flow of history. There was an era where this was regarded, heresy was regarded as warrant for capital punishment. It was not something unique to Calvin. It was not something that he invented for this particular case. Furthermore, the penalty of death at the stake was the decision of Geneva's Council of 25. They had unanimous advice from several other Swiss jurisdictions. It was not just the group in Geneva. It was not just Calvin. It was a group of 25 in Geneva who consulted with other church leaders throughout the country. And so one cannot say this is simply something you depend on Calvin. Furthermore, Dr. Packer has pointed out that other reformers, such as Bucer and Melanchthon, agreed with the judgment that this was an apt punishment for the heresy that had been propagated. So these are some of the things that help us to understand why one may wish that this had not taken place, but it helps us to mitigate and understand some of the context of this. So what are the major contributions? Let's look at some of the positive contributions that Calvin has made. One might be tempted to think Calvin was stuck in the city of Geneva where he pastored a church. Did he have any influence beyond Geneva? Yes, he did. Here's the reason why. The influence spread widely beyond Geneva because Geneva was at the crossroads. It was a trade center, so people from northern Europe traveling to southern Italy and back and forth would pass through Geneva. It was a crossroads. Many refugees came from France and Holland and England and Scotland and Germany and Italy and Spain and Hungary and Poland and other countries. And they came into the city of Geneva. They came and attended the church where Calvin was a pastor. They heard him preach. They heard him teach. They came under his influence. And then some of them, having been there for a while, moved on. Some of the refugees returned from Geneva to their home countries, and in doing so, they spread the Christian truth that they had learned under the teaching and preaching of Calvin. And so this spread the influence. And then when some of these people who had been in Calvin's church left, Calvin continued to carry on an active correspondence with many of these people who moved away and became leaders in churches in their countries. So again, that helped to spread the influence of the reformer. To give an example, there were 88 preachers that were sent out from Geneva to the country of France during the years 1555 to 1562. That's just a 7-year period. 88 preachers were sent out from that church and had an influence then in France. 9 of them were martyred. It was hard during that time of the Huguenots in France to be a Protestant Reformed pastor and church member. In 1555, there was only one Reformed Protestant church in the whole country of France. 7 years later, by 1562, there were 2,150 Protestant churches. It eventually grew to 2 million Protestant churches. So that's an example of how the influence of John Calvin spread beyond Geneva. People not only went into France, but they went into other parts of Europe. For example, some of the European Puritans from the Netherlands, from the UK and so forth, settled in North America. They brought with them to the New World their ideas of Calvinism. And there developed a whole Reformed family of denominations, of Presbyterian and Reformed denominations. They brought along with them their confessions of faith, the three forms of unity, including the canons of the Synod of Dort and the Heidelberg Catechism, the Westminster Confession, the 39 Articles of the Protestant Episcopal Church that were shaped by the ideas of Calvin and indeed had an influence then in North America as well. So Calvin's influence spread geographically. What actually were the key influences that Calvin had? Let me briefly summarize 4 influences, contributions that Calvin made. Number 1 is this: that Calvin helped us see the importance of living a theocentric life which glorifies God. Calvin was a man intoxicated with the majesty and glory of God. No theologian before or since has had such a grasp of God's beauty and loveliness. This marked everything that Calvin ever wrote or did. He stressed the sovereignty of God, that the triune God is totally independent of all else and absolutely self-sufficient. God had no correlates, but is completely and totally absolute. Calvin believed that the sole purpose of life is not just evangelism or to get to heaven, although those are important, but they're not just the sole purpose, but rather the overarching umbrella is this: the purpose of life is to glorify God and to enjoy Him, not only in the future, but in the present life as well. This means that all of life is open to the possibilities of glorifying God. Some modern evangelicals retreat to a cultural ghetto, thinking that God is only interested in what occurs on Sunday morning behind church doors. They think that cultural activity is worldliness and a waste of time. Well, Calvin didn't believe in that. He believed in the value of glorifying God in the fullness of life, be it in our business, our recreation, in the totality of our life. And he stressed 2 principles showing that all of life is worthy of attention. Let me show you these 2 principles. Number 1 is this: that God is absolutely sovereign, not only in redemption, but also in creation. That God's sovereignty in creation's culture extends even to the creative gifts of non-believers. I put on the screen this quote from Calvin where he says, "If the Lord has willed that we be helped in physics, dialectics, mathematics, or other like disciplines, even the work and ministry of the ungodly, let us use this assistance. For if we neglect God's gift freely offered in these arts, we ought to suffer punishment for our sloths." God's sovereign not only in redemption, but also in creation. The second truth that he taught is this: that Christian humanism is contrasted with secular godless humanism. Christian humanism means that even though we need to practice self-denial, this does not mean self-obliteration. that cultural institutions are ramifications of our understanding of what we are as image bearers of God. Sin can pervade culture, but the appropriate response is not to hate culture or retreat from culture or avoid culture, but to consecrate it, to transform it. And that emphasis has been an important contribution of John Calvin. As J. Gresham Machen, the Princeton professor who became the first president of Westminster Seminary, said, instead of destroying the arts and sciences or being indifferent to them, let us cultivate them with all the enthusiasms of the various humanists, but at the same time consecrate them to the service of God. Second contribution of Calvin is this. He contributed to an understanding of God's sovereignty in our salvation. In fact, this is often what people think of when they think of Calvinism, the 5 points of Calvinism that center on salvation from eternity past to eternity future. But as the British London Baptist pastor Charles Spurgeon from another generation has said, Calvinism is just the nickname for biblical Christianity. Or there's a facetious t-shirt that probably overstates it that says Calvinism is what happens when Arminians read the Bible. It's a little overstated, but I think you get the point. Calvinism is simply biblical Christianity. Some have attempted to take Calvin's views on salvation and put them into an acrostic, the acrostic of tulip. T, total depravity. U, unconditional election. L, limited atonement. I, irresistible grace. P, perseverance of the saints. And by the way, Calvin didn't invent tulip. TULIP is an acronym that came from probably the 1920s. It's only about 100 years old, not 500 years old to the time of Calvin. But it is an invented way of how to summarize the teachings of Calvin. And speaking of I, the irresistible grace, why did the Calvinists marry a girl named Grace? He found her irresistible. Oh, I know that's awful. Some have tried to come up with some other variants of tulip. Let me show just another fun thing. Since Calvin had a beard, they have come up with this acronym. The 5 points of beardenism. Okay, total awesomeness, unintentional growth, unlimited growth, limited trimming, irresistible manliness, perseverance of the whiskers. So for those of you who are listening who wear a beard, you can look it up on Google, the 5 points of beardenism. There's another option that I like even more. It's the new tulip that takes the acronym for bacon as the new tulip. B, bad people. A, already elected. C, completely atoned for. O, overwhelmingly called and never falling away. And so the question is not, are you a 5-point Calvinist, but are you a 5-strip baconist? Okay, those are some ways of looking at his views on salvation. A contribution of Calvin. But secondly, a second main contribution is that Calvin is credited with a reform emphasis on the importance of education. He believed in universal education, that all education, he said, is fundamentally religious. And that's why Calvin in Geneva worked to create the academy there. And the academy eventually became the University of Geneva. And some have said this is Calvin's crowning achievement. And subsequently, down through history, the Reformed community has a strong emphasis on education in starting colleges and seminaries and Christian day schools. You have, for example, Covenant College, the college of our denomination, Covenant Seminary, the seminary of our denomination, Reformed Theological Seminary, Westminster Seminary, Calvin College, Calvin University, Covenant Christian Day School, all educational institutions under the umbrella of the Reformed denominations, again, carrying out the original influence and emphasis of John Calvin. And then finally, the last and fourth contribution of Calvin is that he left behind an influential body of writings. 48 volumes of his were published. Probably the most significant work of Calvin was his Institutes. He did a number of editions throughout his lifetime, kept adding to it, revising it. Final edition in 1559 was 79 chapters, over 1,000 pages long. Fortunately, there are some compendiums that are available if you want to read a shorter version. Calvin wrote commentaries on the entire New Testament, except 2nd and 3rd John and the book of Revelation. He wrote commentaries on the Pentateuch, on Psalms, on Joshua, on Isaiah. Total of 48 volumes. From 1550 on, he published 100,000 words a year. A significant body of writing that survives him after 500 years. Let me just close with a couple suggested responses. Response number one, I would encourage you, if you want to know more about Calvin, if you ever read a biography of him, why not take the time to do so? Or read some selections from the Institutes of the Christian Religion. Perhaps taking a chapter, as Sproul suggested, look at his chapter on prayer. There is a famous biography of Calvin written by Parker. Christian History magazine has an issue just on the life of Calvin with all kinds of pictures and graphics. It's available for free on the internet as a PDF file. There are biographies by W. Robert Godfrey and Alistair McGrath, and there are other biographies available as well. Let's close with Calvin's morning prayer. And I'm going to ask you to pray this together with me. Let's pray. Grant, Almighty God, that as you shine on us by your word, we may not be blind at midday, nor willingly see darkness and thus dull our minds asleep. But may we be roused daily by your words. May we stir up ourselves more and more to fear your name, and thus present ourselves and all our pursuits as a sacrifice to you, that you may peaceably rule and perpetually dwell in us until you gather us to your celestial habitation, where there is reserved for us eternal rest and glory. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Next time, we look at Zwingli. Bye for now.